I still remember the morning I woke up with a strange heaviness in my chest and a dark, sticky stain across my right thumb. At first, I thought I had fallen asleep with a pen in my hand. That happens when you get older. You forget small things. You nod off in your chair. You wake up confused. But this was different. This was thick ink. Legal ink. The kind that doesn't wash off easy. And before the sun even finished rising, I would learn that while I slept in the same bed I've slept in for 32 years, someone had used my own fingerprint to steal the house I built with my husband's 2 hands and my own tired heart. By the end of this story, you're going to hear how my own family planned it quietly, smiling in my face while they waited for the moment I was weak enough to be used. You'll hear how the home I thought I would die in was signed away without my knowledge. You'll hear how I was told I no longer belonged in my own living room. And you'll hear how I stood alone, shaking, with nothing but a grocery bag of clothes in my hands and nowhere to sleep that night. But you will also hear how the truth always has a way of clawing its way into the light. You'll hear how the same table where I was betrayed became the place where every lie came crashing down. You'll hear how the ones who thought they were clever learned that some signatures can be reversed and some sins come with a heavy price. And in the end, you'll hear how an old woman who was pushed into the street found her way back home. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through the hardest thing of all, forgiveness. If stories of family, betrayal, survival, and quiet strength touch your heart, please take a moment now to like and subscribe. It helps this old voice reach people who still believe that even after the darkest night, morning can still come. And now, coming back to the story, I'm 71 years old now. My hair is thin and silver. My knees ache when the weather turns. I move slower than I used to, but I wasn't always this slow. Once upon a time, I was a young woman with a strong back, a loud laugh, and a husband who called me his miracle. We bought this house together when our hands were still steady. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a little kitchen with yellow cabinets that never quite closed right. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. We raised our children here. Birthday cakes were cut at that small wooden table. Homework was spread across that same worn surface. Scraped knees were kissed in that hallway. And the night my husband passed away, I held his hand in the very bedroom where I would later be betrayed. After he died, the house grew quiet, too quiet. The children filled it with noise when they visited, but when they left, the walls went silent again. Still, I stayed. I stayed because this home knew me. It knew my voice in every season. It knew my grief. It knew my loneliness. And I believed it would be the one place in the world that could never be taken from me. I was wrong. My son started coming around more often about a year ago. At first, I thought it was love. He brought groceries sometimes. He fixed a loose railing. He sat with me and listened to old stories I'd already told him 100 times. He said he worried about me living alone. He said the world was dangerous now. He said people take advantage of older folks. I didn't realize he was talking about himself. One evening, he brought paperwork. He said it was just in case something ever happened to me. He said it would make things easier when I was gone. I told him I wasn't going anywhere yet. He laughed and said, "I know, Mom. This is just planning." The papers were thick, legal words twisted across the pages like vines. I told him my eyes weren't what they used to be. He told me not to worry. He said everything was normal. He said it was just a simple safeguard. I trusted him. I raised him. I rocked him through fevers. I shielded him from storms. So when he asked me to place my thumb on the little ink pad for a future document that might be needed someday, I did it without fear. I wiped my thumb on a napkin afterward and forgot all about it. I didn't know that the real signing would come later. The night before everything broke, my daughter-in-law stayed over. She brought soup. She tucked a blanket around me. She told me I looked tired. I was tired. My chest had been heavy for days. My breathing shallow. Age catches up to you, quietly like that. I fell asleep early in my bedroom. The soft hum of the television murmuring me into dreams. And sometime in the night, while my body rested and my guard was down, someone pressed my thumb into ink again. Someone lifted my sleeping hand. Someone used the very fingerprint that once signed my husband's name into our life together to sign me out of it. I woke up with ink on my thumb and no memory of how it got there. At first, I laughed at it. I thought I had dreamed it. I went to wash my hands, but the ink wouldn't come off. It stayed there like a shadow, a warning I didn't yet understand. The knock at the door came just after breakfast. 2 men stood on my porch. One held a clipboard. The other stood stiff and quiet. They asked for my name. I gave it. They told me the property had legally changed ownership. I told them they were mistaken. They handed me papers. I stared at my own fingerprint pressed at the bottom like a confession. My legs gave out. By sunset, I was no longer welcome inside my own home. That night, I slept in my car in a grocery store parking lot. The seat was cold. My bones ached, and I cried the way only old women cry, quietly, with no strength left to waste on sound. But this is only the beginning, because what they didn't expect was that I still remembered every promise I had ever made to myself, and I was not finished yet. The first night in my car felt longer than any night I had ever lived. The seat belt pressed into my shoulder. The smell of old coffee and engine oil hung in the air. Every time someone walked past, headlights swept across the windshield, lighting up my face like a stranger's. I kept telling myself this couldn't be real, that I would wake up in my bed, that my kitchen would still be waiting for me in the morning with its crooked yellow cabinets and the little crack in the tile near the sink. But morning came, and I was still in that car. My back screamed when I tried to straighten up. My legs felt numb from being bent all night. I wiped my face and felt tears still wet on my cheeks. I looked down at my thumb. The ink was faint now, but I could still see it. That mark had taken everything from me. I sat there for a long time before I started the engine. I didn't know where to go. I had never needed a place to go. For decades, the answer had always been the same: home. And now that word felt like something from a storybook, something other people had. I drove to the park first. I needed air. I needed to breathe somewhere that didn't smell like fear. I parked near the trees and opened the door slowly, like I was afraid the world might push me back inside. The sun was just rising over the grass. Birds hopped near the benches. Life was going on like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just been erased from my own life. I sat on one of those cold metal benches and held my purse close to my chest. Inside it were my wallet, my hairbrush, the small photo of my husband I always carried, and a folded grocery bag with 2 changes of clothes. That was all that remained of my old world. I thought about calling my son. Then I remembered his face the day the papers were handed to me. He had stood behind those men, arms crossed, eyes sliding away from mine. He never spoke, not once. He didn't say I'm sorry. He didn't say it was a mistake. He watched me lose my house like he was waiting for a bus. That silence hurt more than the theft. I thought about calling my daughter, but her voice was already in my head. Tired, distant, always busy, always promising to call back later. I had spent years making excuses for her. That day, I didn't have the strength for one more. So instead, I called a number I hadn't used in over 10 years. The local legal aid office. My hands shook as I held the phone. My pride fought me hard. I had never asked for help before. I had always been the one who helped others, the one who cooked for sick neighbors, the one who watched kids when parents worked late, the one who donated what little she could when the church called. Now, I was the one with nothing. A young woman answered. Her voice was gentle. When she asked what I needed, the words came out broken and tangled. I told her about the fingerprint. I told her about the house. I told her how I was sleeping in my car. When I finished, I expected silence. What I got was something I hadn't felt since the night before my husband died. I got hope. She told me to come in. She told me not to give up yet. She told me they had seen cases like this before. People stealing quietly from the weak. Children turning into strangers. She told me not to be ashamed. That last part made me cry. I drove there right away. The office was small and crowded. Old chairs, peeling paint, the smell of stale coffee. But to me, it felt like a palace. It was the first place that hadn't shut its doors on me. They listened to everything, every detail, the paperwork, the ink, the night, the quiet betrayal. They took copies of what I had. They explained words I didn't understand. Forgery, fraud, undue influence. Each word felt heavy, but they also felt like weapons I could finally hold. They warned me it wouldn't be fast, that family cases were the hardest, that money had a way of poisoning even good people. I laughed at that. My people had been poisoned long before money ever entered the picture. That evening, they helped me find a temporary room at a shelter for seniors. Just a small bed, a shared bathroom, a thin blanket, but it was warm. And when I laid down that night on a mattress that belonged to me, even for a little while, I felt human again. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. I learned how heavy grief feels when it mixes with betrayal. I learned how hunger changes the way time moves. I learned how quiet shame can be when it wraps itself around your bones. My son never called. My daughter sent one message, One sentence. I heard what happened. I hope things work out. That was all. No visit. No offer of help. Just that cold, thin line of words. At night, I would lie awake and think about the house. I imagined strangers walking through my living room, sitting at my table, sleeping in my bed, touching the walls that still held the warmth of my husband's hands. I felt like I had been erased from my own story, but something else was growing inside me too. Something slow, something stubborn, a quiet anger that didn't burn hot, but steady, the kind that doesn't scream, the kind that waits. One afternoon, the legal aid attorney called me into her office. She told me they had found something. The signature on the transfer didn't match earlier prints. The timing didn't match any appointment or legal meeting. There was no witness, no video, no proper consent. In other words, someone had cut every corner they could. My son had tried to steal my house like a thief in the night. When the legal papers were served to him, he finally showed up. He came to the shelter parking lot in a clean pressed shirt and polished shoes. He looked like a stranger, not the boy I had taught to ride a bike, not the man I had buried a husband for and raised alone. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and said my name like it was a chore. "Why are you doing this to me, Mom?" he asked. The words hit me so hard I almost laughed. Why was I doing this to him? I told him I wanted my home back. He shook his head and said I had already given it to him. I told him I had been asleep. He said I had known what I was doing. He told me I was confused, that I wasn't well, that I needed care. That was when I understood the full depth of the plan. They hadn't just taken my house. They had planned to take my voice too. The court date was set for months later. More waiting, more nights on a borrowed bed, more mornings waking up with the same question pounding in my chest. Why? Why would a child do this? In the quiet of those months, memories came back to me in pieces. Moments I had once brushed off. The way my daughter-in-law always asked about the deed. The way my son pushed for paperwork. The way they watched me when I fell asleep in my chair. The way they whispered in the kitchen and went quiet when I entered the room. The signs had been there. I just didn't want to see them. And then one morning, just when my case was gaining strength, a new message came. It wasn't from my son. It wasn't from my daughter. It was from the real estate office. The house had been listed for sale. That was when I knew the worst was still ahead of me. When I saw that listing online, the pictures nearly took my breath away. My living room looked brighter than it ever had for me. They had moved my furniture, changed the curtains, taken down my family photos. It looked like a stranger's house dressed up for sale. The description said it was vacant. That word cut into me deeper than anything else I had felt so far. Vacant, like I had never lived there, like my husband had never died there, like my children had never laughed under that roof, like I had never stood at the kitchen sink for decades, washing dishes with tired hands and quiet prayers. They were going to sell it. They were trying to erase me completely. The legal aid attorney told me they would file an emergency motion to freeze the sale. She warned me that my son was moving fast, faster than people usually do when they think they might lose. That told her something. It told her He was desperate, or scared, or both. It told me he had something to hide. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the narrow shelter bed and held my husband's photo in my hands. I whispered his name into the dark, like he might hear me wherever he was. I asked him what I should do. I asked him how our own child could become someone I no longer recognized. In the days that followed, pressure came at me from every direction. My son began leaving voicemail messages. At first, they were calm. He said we could work this out privately. He said I was embarrassing the family. He said people were talking. Then his tone changed. He said I was ungrateful. He said I was selfish. He said I was destroying everything he had worked for. Then the threats started. He said the case would ruin me. He said no one would believe an old woman over a man in his prime. He said I would die alone in a shelter if I kept pushing. I listened to every message all the way through. I never erased a single one. My attorney told me not to. She said voices don't lie the way faces do. My daughter never called, but word reached me through a distant cousin that she knew everything, that she had known from the beginning, that she had agreed my son deserved the house more. I don't know what hurts worse, being betrayed without explanation or being betrayed with full awareness. As the court date drew closer, I was asked to give formal testimony. They recorded me on video. They asked about my health, my awareness, my memory. They asked if I had ever been diagnosed with confusion, if I had ever forgotten my own address, if I had ever left the stove on. Each question felt less like law and more like a slow stripping away of dignity. I answered everyone honestly. Yes, I forget little things sometimes. No, I am not confused. No, I did not give away my home while sleeping. The forensic expert later confirmed what my heart already knew. The fingerprint had been lifted from a glass I had used that evening. It had been transferred, placed, pressed. It had been stolen. When my son was confronted with that evidence, he broke. Not in court yet, not in public, but one afternoon, he showed up at the shelter again, unannounced. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands trembled. He looked younger and older at the same time. He asked if we could talk alone. I agreed. We sat on a wooden bench under a dying tree. The wind shook dry leaves down around our feet, like quiet applause from the past. He stared at the ground for a long time before he spoke. He told me he was drowning in debt. He told me the business deal he had bragged about failed, that the loan sharks didn't care about family or history, that he had used the house as collateral once before and fixed it just in time, that this time he ran out of time. He told me he was afraid, and then he said something that will stay with me until my last breath. He said, "You weren't using the house anyway." In that moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt invisible. I told him I was still alive. I told him I still cooked. I still dreamed. I still remembered. I told him that when he was sick as a boy, I slept on the floor beside his bed. That when his father died, I worked 2 jobs so he wouldn't feel the change too sharply. He didn't look up. He said he thought I wouldn't fight back. That sentence broke something inside me. The emergency motion to freeze the sale went through just days before the scheduled closing. The buyers were furious. My son was cornered. The truth was circling him now from every side. And that's when people who had been silent suddenly found voices. Neighbors I hadn't seen since being forced out came forward. They said they had seen my daughter-in-law hovering over me that night. They said they had seen strange visitors in the driveway. They said they had thought something felt wrong, but didn't want to get involved. My daughter was finally summoned to testify. She walked into the courtroom with her chin lifted and her eyes hard. She would not look at me. When they asked her if she knew about the document signing, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. That pause said everything. The judge watched her closely. The walls were closing in now, but the hardest blow was still ahead, because just when I believed the truth would finally bring justice, I learned what it truly costs to win against your own blood. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not just the air, but the feeling in the room. Cold wood, cold walls, cold glances. I walked in slowly with my attorney beside me, my hands folded so tightly I could barely feel my fingers anymore. Across the room, my son sat at the defense table. My daughter sat one row behind him. They both looked straight ahead, like I was already gone. I took my seat and felt my heart beating so loud in my chest, I was sure everyone could hear it. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. And just like that, the last fight of my old life began. The attorney for my son spoke first. He painted me as tired, fragile, confused. He said I had willingly chosen to transfer the house because I knew I could no longer maintain it. He said my son had only stepped in to help. He said this entire case was a misunderstanding made worse by pride. As he spoke, I realized something. He wasn't just trying to save my son. He was trying to bury me while I was still breathing. Then my attorney stood up. She was calm, clear, unshaking. She laid out the timeline, the fingerprint evidence, the forged consent, the abnormal transfer procedure, the late-night movements. The listing for sale before ownership was legally settled. She played the voicemails my son had left me. When his voice filled the courtroom, rough and shaking with anger and fear, something shifted. He sounded guilty. The room grew very quiet. Then it was time for testimony. My son was called first. He walked to the stand stiffly, his jaw tight. At first, he repeated the same story, that I had agreed, that I was aware, that I had done it willingly. But then the forensic expert testified. They explained how fingerprints can be harvested, transferred, misused. My son began to sweat when they played footage showing the exact transfer method, matching the way the ink had been placed. His shoulders slumped. His confidence cracked. Then my daughter was called. This time, she did look at me, but only once. And when she did, I saw something flicker across her face. Not grief, not sympathy, fear. She swore she knew nothing. She said she only found out afterward. She said she trusted her brother. Then the neighbors testified. One by one, they spoke about the quiet movements that night, about the strange visitors, about watching my daughter-in-law lifting my hand while I slept, about how they had stood frozen in their windows unsure of what they were witnessing. The courtroom began to murmur. My daughter's face drained of color. Then the most painful moment of all came. My attorney called me to the stand. The walk felt longer than it was. Every step felt like I was crossing years instead of floorboards. I sat. I raised my right hand. I swore to tell the truth. And for a moment, I could not speak. My voice came out thin at first. I told them everything. I told them about the night my husband died, about the years I stayed behind in that house alone, about the meals left uneaten when the kids stopped visiting, about how grateful I felt when my son suddenly returned, about how I trusted him with papers I could barely read, about how I woke up with ink on my thumb, about how two strangers told me I had been erased. At one point, the judge leaned forward. When I finished, my son was crying, not loudly, quiet crying, the kind that has no power left in it. The verdict came 2 hours later. The transfer was declared fraudulent. The deed was reversed. The sale was permanently blocked. The room exhaled. Legally, I had won, but when the judge finished speaking and everyone began to stand, I didn't feel victory. I felt exhausted. My son was immediately taken into custody for further charges related to fraud. As they placed handcuffs on him, he looked at me for the first time that day, with his full face, not with anger, with shame. My daughter stood frozen in her seat, her arms wrapped around herself like she was suddenly cold. She didn't move when they let her brother out. She didn't follow him. She didn't call my name. I walked out of the courtroom, feeling like I had just buried something invisible. 3 days later, I was escorted back to my house. The door still creaked the same way. The light still fell the same way through the living room window, but everything felt wrong, empty, like a stage after the actors have gone home. My furniture had been moved. Some of my things were missing. My husband's chair had been sold. The picture frames were gone. The house was legally mine again, but emotionally, it felt abandoned. That night, I slept on the floor. I didn't want to touch the bed yet. 2 weeks passed. Then came the knock at my door. When I opened it, my daughter stood there alone. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her voice trembled when she said my name. And that was the moment I realized the hardest part of this story had not yet begun. When I opened the door and saw my daughter standing there, I didn't know what I felt first. Shock, anger, relief, or the deep aching pull of a mother's heart that never truly stops loving, no matter how badly it's been hurt. She looked thinner, older. Her eyes were swollen, like she had been crying for days. She stood there with her hands clasped together like a nervous child, not the confident woman who had once turned her back on me without hesitation. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The house was quiet behind me. The wind moved faintly through the trees outside, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, reminding me that the world was still moving, even if mine had nearly stopped. Finally, she whispered, "Mom, can I come in?" Every part of me wanted to say no. Every scar inside me screamed to slam the door and remind her of the nights I slept in my car, the shelter bed, the court humiliation, the silence, the betrayal. But another voice, older and deeper, spoke louder. It said, "This is still your child." I stepped aside. She walked in slowly, like she was afraid the floor might collapse beneath her. She looked around the living room, at the rearranged furniture, the empty spaces where memories once stood. Her eyes filled with tears. "He really did sell Dad's chair," she whispered. I didn't answer. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. For a long time, she just cried quietly. I stood by the window with my arms folded, staring out at the yard where my children once played, waiting for the words I had waited months to hear. "I knew," she finally said, "about the fingerprint, about the papers, about everything." That truth hit me harder than any lie ever could. "I was scared," she continued. "Your brother owed dangerous people. He said if he didn't get the house, they would take everything, that they would hurt his family. He told me you would be okay, that you wouldn't even know." I turned to face her then. "And what part of that made you think I would survive sleeping in my car?" I asked. She sobbed harder at that. "There is no excuse," she said. "None. I failed you. I chose fear over you. And now I've lost my brother to prison, and I almost lost my mother forever." Her shoulders shook as the weight finally caught up with her. Silence filled the room again. I thought about every night I waited for her call, every birthday message that didn't come, every time I defended her to friends who asked why she never visited, every excuse I made for her absence. And I realized something quietly and painfully true. Holding on to anger was killing me more slowly than losing my house ever could. So I walked over to her, and I placed my hand on her shaking shoulder. "I didn't raise you to be perfect," I said softly. "I raised you to be honest when you break." She looked up at me through wet lashes. "I forgive you," I said. She collapsed into my arms like a child and cried the way she hadn't cried since she was small. And for the first time in a year, I felt my house feel warm again. Weeks passed. My son took a plea deal. He will be gone for a long time. I write to him sometimes, not to scold, not to shame, just to remind him that a mother's love does not vanish when trust is broken. He writes back in simple words. He says he is sorry. I believe him now. My daughter comes every weekend. She cooks in my kitchen. She cleans the floors. She listens when I talk. Really listens. Trust is growing again. Slowly, carefully, like glass being pieced back together, one shard at a time. And my house feels like mine again. Not because of the deed, but because peace has returned. Sometimes at night, I still wake up and rub my thumb without thinking. The ghost of ink isn't there anymore, but the memory remains. And maybe it always will, but I no longer sleep with fear. If this story taught me anything, it is this: evil can take your things. It can take your comfort. It can even take your home, but it cannot take your soul unless you hand it over. And forgiveness is not weakness. It is the strongest thing an old heart can learn. If this story touched you, moved you, or reminded you of someone you love, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who may be hurting in silence. and subscribe so this voice can keep reaching hearts that still believe healing is possible. From an old woman who lost her home and found her family again. Thank you for listening.